On today's show, we talked to Degreed CEO David Blake. This is a fascinating conversation. I've actually known David, given that he was rolling around in the Utah tech scene in the early aughts, 2010s, let's say. One of the first events I ever did, actually, was with David Blake at BYU and another founder of an incredible company come out of Utah, Ryan Caldwell from MX. Great memories, actually. And so it was great to sit down with him. This is one of the most thoughtful CEOs in the world. This is probably the most well-read CEO in the world, or one of them. What he's working on is really fascinating. He approaches problems in a different way. He approaches the education system. This guy actually is the very first person we've ever had who ran for vice president. He's our first vice presidential candidate to ever come on this show. It's a fascinating character. You won't want to miss this interview. Here is David Blake, the CEO of Degreed. David, thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to see you. Great to have you on the show. Obviously, we've known each other in the past through various things and the Utah tech scene and Utah tech community and things through that. But it's been a while since we've caught up. I'd love to, one, have you introduce what Degreed is to our audience and how you became CEO and co-founder of this thing.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I actually native Utahn and once again live in Utah, but spent 10 years in San Francisco. So in many ways, I feel like I'm just getting reintroduced to the Utah tech community.
We got you back.
I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, I'm back, baby. Yeah, so Degreed was this obsession, this passion around lifelong learning. And I was working for a Silicon Valley-backed roll-up of universities. They were buying universities and merging them together, taking them online. I as such, went through this accreditation process, both national and regional, and was exposed to what accreditation is and isn't, and started to become obsessed with the thought of the signal in our education, and started asking people, tell me about your education. And inevitably, people would answer one of three ways. They would tell you where they went to university, what degree they have, or that they didn't go to college. And the more I began to hear it, the more absurd it started to feel to me. And just to draw it out, because we are conditioned to the absurdity of it. But, if I were to ask you, Clint, tell me about your health, and you're like, oh yeah, Dave, I ran a marathon 21 years ago. I'd be like, cool. And, that doesn't answer the question. But when you ask people, tell me about your education, they with a straight face will say like, oh yeah, I went to SMU. It's like, okay, and marathons aren't bad, and neither is university, though I have my critiques, but it betrays the fact that we have no language to answer for lifelong education. And so that was the mission and the obsession behind Degreed, was how do we help people transact on all of their lifelong education, irrespective of how or where they got it. So all of, yes, your academics, but also all of your professional training, as well as all the informal stuff. And that's really where a majority of your learning is going to be. You're going to learn more from books on average than you will from professors or teachers in your lifetime. And yet, there was never any way of reflecting that and sort of being able to transact on it in your professional life.
Yeah. And so the idea, you're way ahead of your time here when you're thinking about this, though, because, we now look at universities and we all have critiques, right? And we all have, but it wasn't too long ago where universities were still prestigious. I mean, maybe they still are, but in my sense of it is they're not, sure. Or at least in our world, right? And so you're way ahead of your time here in thinking about this. What drives you to start a company around it?
Yeah, I'm an elder millennial, and so this betrays a little bit of my age, but early in my career, I kept a physical binder with newspaper and article clippings of any time I saw anyone willing to critique higher education or the degree. And, I found 6 articles. It wasn't that many, and now you could fill a book full of it. So yes, once upon a time, sort of the degree was the pathway, the one and only blessed and, sanctified pathway into the middle class life in America. It's what every, parent wanted for every, child. And, anymore, it really is shifting. We can talk about kind of how much, I think, and what it's going to mean. Um, but yeah, what led me to do it? Um, the short version to what is ultimately a lot of inputs takes me back to when I was in high school. And when I sat for the ACT, I just found the experience just blew my mind. I was like, at some point, all the grown-ups got together and decided that this like 3-hour test was going to be how they sorted all the 17-year-olds in and out of their future. And I was like, no way, not for real. Like, this is it. Like, this is you grown-ups. Like, this is it. This is what y'all came up with. And I was just so floored by the fact that, for me, it was American Fork High School, at 10:30 a.m. on a Saturday when I was 17. And I was just like, this can't really be it. And that was kind of the spark that, got me interested in education. I started, again, elder millennial. I went to the library and started reading books on the history of education. And I had this dawning realization that I was graduating top of my class. So an excellent student, but those books were the first thing I'd ever read that a teacher hadn't assigned to me. And so I had this like dawning realization. I was like, oh, what's that feeling? It's like, oh, that must be curiosity. That must be what that feels like. And I realized that here I was, an excellent student and honestly, a terrible learner. I was good at memorizing and test taking, but the education was never the point. Winning the game was the point. And I was starting to fall in love with actual learning. And so I aspired to be a great learner, even if it meant I had to give up being a good student. And that's been the sort of passion and obsession of my adult life. And as I continue to develop myself as a learner, at some point, it's like, we need to empower people to be able to unlock the doors and unlock the gates with their lifelong learning and with their skills, because we had set up this kind of toll gate, which was, universities had a monopoly on the degree, on the sheepskin. And that was the doorway to better life. And it's like, we need to democratize that. So I became really obsessed with the credential, the signal. And this was in a moment where everyone else in ed tech, and even that was just sort of coming into its own as a category, but everyone else was really focused on content, democratizing the actual learning. So plural sites, Udemy, Coursera, Masterclass, Khan Academy. We had all these like content proliferation, going on, which was really important. But yeah, I was over on my own little island talking about jailbreaking the degree. And for the most part, when I'd go pitch VCs, it mostly ended up in arguments, VCs saying why, their Stanford degree was forever.
I went to
going
Wharton.
To
what are you
the
talking about? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. So, it took a minute for kind of others to maybe see it. But I think at this point, like you said, it's a little bit more commonly critiqued than it once was.
And so what does degree do? Like, what was the idea for, like, so I hear all that and, that's,
Yeah.
I agree with everything you just said. And then, but how do you turn that like idea and this passion for learning and this, how do we turn the university system on its head and focus more on what we're learning rather than credentials? How do you do that and turn that into a company?
Sure. We're kind of a many years to becoming an overnight success type story. But the Genesis Degree was born in 2012. So I started it initially on my own, would recruit a co-founder in Eric Sharp here in Salt Lake, and then Kat Kennedy as our third. So to go back to 2012, that was like kind of the peak of like quantified self, so when Fitbit was at its, pinnacle. And so we had that kind of as an analog of like, okay, let's just track all of everyone's learning and we'll kind of be the quantified self for your learning, for your education. And then one of my early investors was actually the founder of FICO, as in like your FICO credit score. And so, then I had kind of this analog of like, well, what if there's a way of sort of scoring, people's educations or quantifying people's skills? And so, I mean, there was different analogs. But we started with consumers, launched direct to consumer because I believed it needed to be lifelong. And for it to be lifelong, you needed to own your profile, your data. And so people did start tracking their learning on the platform, but we weren't monetizing. And so, we're a nonprofit at that moment in time, just, no revenue model, and figured I'd need to crack enterprise for two reasons. One, a business model, and two, I didn't just want this to be kind of a toy, almost use the Clayton Christensen terminology, toys are neat, but at some point, if it's going to matter in our career, it needs to have consequence in the market with employers. And so figured if we could get employers to buy into our point of view, it would give credence to the model and it would make an impact in the world. And so, the fork in the road, which we didn't know, was, is this going to be something we go into recruiting? So help sort of inventory and track people's learning so recruiters can find you and then, recruit you into organizations. Or do we do this inside of companies as part of their corporate training, learning, and development? And we explored the recruiting first. And ultimately, we're just kind of frustrated. And only after really exhausting ourselves on kind of that, recruiting side of it, did we think to go and examine it with inside organizations, with corporate L&D, learning and development. And almost as soon as we did, I mean, it just, it was kind of like a hot knife through butter. They didn't know, once upon a time, the corporate LMS housed everything that a company would administer, but all of a sudden there were companies like Pluralsight and Coursera, which were their own consumer destinations. And so companies knew people were learning beyond their walls, but didn't have any line of sight into it. And so when we showed up and said, hey, we're this platform that's built to track everyone's learning across the entire ecosystem, they were like, holy shit, that's exactly what we need. And so our first client was a used car dealership for $15,000. Our second client was a small account for $10,000. And then our third account was a global account with Bank of America, multi-million-dollar global account. And so it really was it took us 3 years to get to revenue. And then, our third ever client was a multi-million-dollar, multi-year global Fortune 20 account. And then it was kind of off to the races.
That is incredible. And what have you learned since? Like once you found product market fit, what have you learned about leadership and what it means to scale a company?
Yeah, I mean, so Degreed is now 12 years old. Thinking back on the early days, one of the things I maybe just didn't even fully appreciate myself. I've since started other companies, and Degreed just had this uncompromising mission to jailbreak the degree. And having that set in stone from the very beginning, orienting everything to it, all of the principles of the organizations. One just tactical example of this is I wrote down, principles that to help guide the organization that I believed would give us the guardrails of being able to, stay focused on this mission. And one of them was, is if it ends, it ends. We don't exist to be self-perpetuating. One of them was we don't exist to be revenue maximizing. We exist to accomplish the mission. And I took all of our investors through all of our principles, including those, and read them, stated all of our principles before I would allow them to invest. And I did so as sort of this pre-qualifier of like, you've got to know this is what I'm value and this is what I'm optimizing for, and this is how I'm going to make decisions. And if you sort of can't ultimately support me, as a leader operating this way, then, you shouldn't invest. And it sounds maybe very noble and I don't know, maybe in some ways like self-aggrandizing or something. But the truth was it was scary and hard. I never had competing term sheets. And so this was not a way of me choosing between, 6 different VCs. I pitched 100 VCs, got 99 no's, got one yes, but before I would take their money, told them that this company doesn't exist to be revenue maximizing, and if you aren't okay with that, don't write the check. And so it was really scary, but it was a way of, qualifying that side of the business to stay aligned to the mission. And, there's many other ways in which, as keeping the employees and keeping how our business model sort of oriented, I'll give you one more, is just data ownership. So for it to be lifelong learning, the employee needs to own their data. And so that's very anomalous to have a corporate enterprise SaaS business where the employer doesn't own the data, but where the end user owns their data. And, that makes getting through info security and procurement, just all the harder. Every account we close is even harder because of our data ownership model. But we held on to that, principle so that this mission can ultimately kind of be fulfilled. So, that's kind of how we kept it pointed at that North Star.
I've obviously like I think I've interviewed before. I think one of my first events actually was you and Ryan Caldwell at BYU or something like that. Like we've done
Yeah.
a variety of things, and so I think I have a sense for what your answer is here. But for those who are listening or watching or maybe hearing you for the first time, what is wrong with the university system?
Oh man. Oh, so many ways to answer that. So first, I'm not anti-university. We desperately need them in the solution set, but the narrative and generationally, it's so warped because it worked for our grandparents. It even worked for our parents, and so they know it worked for them. And the advice that they're now giving, but it's just skewed. And in 1976, you could pay for full Harvard tuition if you worked full time for 3 months in the summer at a minimum wage job. And now, if you worked full time 12 months a year on a minimum wage job, you couldn't pay for tuition. I mean, it's just generationally, the equation has just gotten so, skewed. And just to, two more stats. I mean, I could go a lot of directions with this. But right now in higher education, we have about a 55% graduation rate after time and a half. So that's at the 6 year mark, how many people have graduated from a 4 year degree. And right now the number is about 55%. It's even worse if you measure it at 4 years. And then of those who graduate, the malemployment rate is also north of 50%. So that's how many people get a job that requires their actual degree. And so about half of people graduate, and of those who do, half will use their degree. And just the price tag on it and then it's just the price tag's gotten too expensive. And so the ROI of it all is just compressing, 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 compressing. And now you have to be really careful. It 35 years ago, it was just universally, if you got accepted, go. Every degree from every university had a positive lifetime ROI, but that is no longer true. There are a whole bunch of majors that you can graduate in. So it's major plus the institution combination. But man, now the list is long. There are many majors you can graduate from that have a negative lifetime earning. It's ROI negative. But the narrative hasn't quite caught up. We still have this narrative of like, you know, KIPP Charter School, has their students like every morning chant a mantra of like how they're going to go to university. And, it was cute 20 years ago, but now I think it's immoral. Like you're telling these kids like the whole point of all of this is to get into university because if you do, you're gonna be okay, you'll make it. And it used to be true and it's not anymore. And so, it's just structurally the payout, the payoff is no longer guaranteed to be positive, but the narrative hasn't caught up. And so, man, we are saddling so much debt around so many people's necks. And it's just, it's just killing a generation.
And interestingly, like our government leaders, who don't know how to solve anything, have decided like they're going to cancel the student loan debt, which then puts it on society itself and anybody who didn't go. I mean, and I don't really know that I have an opinion one way or another about canceling student debt, but it's reached like that level of a crisis to where like, hey, we have all this student loan debt. How do we do this? They're not going to be able to pay it back. So what do we do here? And the idea currently, and again, I don't know that I think it's a good or a bad idea, but the idea currently is like, let's just cancel it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we might come around to it, but I stepped down as CEO of Degreed in 2018 to do political organizing. So I'm also deeply politically motivated, fiercely independent, believe that sort of the ever widening partisan divide is what's going to fissure American two-party democracy. Worthy rivals is okay. To treat each other as enemies is not and will be, the ultimate, sort of chink in the armor. One of the things I've appreciated about the ed tech world is that so far it's been able to resist kind of the same binary polarization. I mean, you've got these questions of teacher unions and student debts and some of these things. And, at least in the community, you'll find people typically tend to be still thoughtful and maybe nuanced instead of just immediately tribal and red and blue. When it comes to student debt, I don't actually believe that forgiveness is just the right policy mechanism to get us to a better place. We can't just keep doing what we're doing and then just kind of forgiving the debt. I mean, that isn't like a good solution. I think the start to a better solution is student debt is the only kind of debt that you can't discharge in bankruptcy. And so, that keeps the incentives kind of all skewed, and because there's never any downside risk to being the lender, and so then you really don't care about the outcomes, and so you're willing to lend irrespective as to whether or not it's going to be a good investment, because ultimately you're going to get paid back one way or another. We need to feel we need the sort of financial repercussions to flow back through to the lenders for good outcomes. And if that were true, all of a sudden people wouldn't lend to, oh, you want to go to University XYZ and get major ABC? Like, sure, you're welcome to do that on your own dime, but as a lender, we're not going to subsidize, we're not going to pay for you to go down that route, because the actuaries, sitting behind me now say that that's one of the negative ROI, majors. So no, thank you. And I'm a fierce believer in a broad-based education in liberal arts. But ultimately, if the ROI on something gets better, people will consume more of it. So we've got to fix the solution. This isn't like hey, everyone needs to be a business major and or an engineer, and otherwise we shouldn't have any federal support for our education system. But we've got to clean it up, get the ROI working for people again. And when we do, people will learn more and more of all of the things. And so, but right now, are we headed that direction? I mean, there's a lot of people chipping away at the problem, but for the most part, no, we haven't meaningfully sort of started, rebuilding this in the way I think we need to.
Yeah, it does seem like the whole idea is like we're just going to cancel the student debt and then all this problem goes away. It doesn't seem like that at all. In fact, part of what we're saying is like you should keep going in debt to go to university because the government will pay it or you don't have to pay it back. Like but we're not addressing like should you even be doing this?
Yeah, and there's I'll add one more thing to this conversation, which is I think there's a really dangerous trend, which is now you're seeing some employers offer free university as a employer benefit. So companies like Walmart, companies like Disney, companies like Home Depot and Chipotle, they are offering free university to their employees. But what that did is we've shifted who's now willing to pay. So Chipotle isn't paying for their people to go to university because they care about the education. They are doing it because it's the cheapest way of retaining employees for the longest. And so But
Hmm.
what it did is right as people were starting to vote with their feet. And so undergraduate enrollment is now down year over year. And that's part demographics, but it's also because the ROI, marginal benefit equals marginal cost. We finally have just gotten to where people are starting to vote with their feet and we're starting to see other pathways get developed. And right as that moment kind of was coming, employers were like, hey, don't you worry about footing the bill. We'll pay for it. Come and scoop guacamole for us and we will pay for your online degree. And the graduation rate for people pursuing higher education that way is abysmal, like truly abysmal, single digit, graduation rates. It isn't a good pathway to degrees, but Chipotle is willing to do it just because, oh, our employees used to stay on average for 5 months and now they're willing on average to stay for 10. And you know what? That's cheaper than paying sort of the recruiting and turnover fees, to pay for 2 semesters of an online degree. And that's, I think, a pretty dangerous kind of shift because what it's doing is it's propping up the system. Now universities don't need to bring their tuition rates down. They just found someone who's willing to pay that exorbitant, rate. And so now tuition's going to kind of hover around where it is for another, probably 2 decades, when I think we were finally at the moment where we were going to see some real downward pricing pressure.
And to add to the problem even further, artificial intelligence. How is that going to change education? How is that changing companies like Degreed, or even like these companies like Pluralsight and on the who are working on the other end of the spectrum? This has to be I mean, it's going to monumentally shift every industry, but it seems like education's maybe one of the first ones.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the, like when you see like OpenAI, just announced the 4.0, and like when they name the use cases, it's always one of the like 7 use cases as a personal tutor. What we're seeing so far in the data is that it is, in many ways, it's kind of leveling the playing field. That AI is the biggest benefit to those with actually the lowest skill level. So, I mean, that's positive in some ways. I think the challenge is, you know, it's going to be a commodity when all of us have AI in our pocket. Is that going to really differentiate so I mean, I think meaningful career success is still going to correlate with sort of deep foundational skill building. um and then I mean the big shift is, um I think what it's going to do is, part of the reason why college degrees have been so powerful is because it's this one universal heuristic. Whether you're from Japan, or from Mexico, or you're from the UAE, I can say I've got a JD, and what that means. It's the only universal credential we have in the whole world. We have other ubiquitous credentials, like a CFA or a CPA. But if you're not actually in those industries, you might not actually know like how hard, to calibrate what that credential really means. If I tell you I'm GGNA certified, you probably don't actually have any real sense for, what that means in its industry, the way that like Series 7, might to someone in finance. So that's been the power of college degrees, is they're ubiquitous, and then we haven't had a way of sort of normalizing or measuring people's skills. And that's really the shift that AI, I think, is going to meaningfully bring, is all of a sudden, you're going to be able to inventory everyone's skills in real time and then give them a personalized learning and development path forward from that place, and be able to manage people's learning that way. And we'll be able to manage the workforce and who gets put on, which projects because they have the unique skill set. I think it's going to create for a much more fluid kind of workforce. And I think, the last thing I'll say here is, and sort of the downstream, as that matures, you're actually going to start getting paid based on what skills you have instead of just what job you have. And 10 years from now, we'll think, how absurd and quaint it was that essentially me and, if you're in a big company, that you might have 40, 400, 4,000 people with the same job title as you getting paid the same thing. And we'll look back and think, shit, that was crazy. Like you were paying 4,000 people the same. Like there's no chance all 4,000 of those people have the same, mix of skills. Like what were we doing? Like, how quaint and outdated that will feel here in a minute.
Do you think we go from job postings to skills postings?
Absolutely.
And what will that look like in terms like for companies? So they advertise, hey, here we're looking for these types of skills. They bring them on, and through AI and their own internal training, they build them up and give them advancement that way. That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah. So McKinsey's done kind of the first, most of the research that's happening on this question is everyone's done like one good wave of research. So McKinsey and World Economic Forum and Korn Ferry and and McKinsey's got research out. It's now actually about a year old on skill-based hiring. And what they found, I hope to sort of no one's surprised at this point. So they looked at hiring based on credentials, hiring based on work experience, and hiring based on skill. And they found that skill-based hiring is more than 5x more predictive of on-the-job success than hiring based on credentials. And that hopefully people kind of like just grok at this point. Everyone, knows that college was this broad heuristic and, probably shouldn't surprise too many people. But it should blow your freaking mind because 99.9% of every job posting and every company hiring anyone is hiring people based on their work experience. So that is the de facto way that we find, source, and filter candidates to be hired for a job. But what they found is that skill-based hiring is more than 3.5 times predictive of on-the-job success than hiring based on work experience. And that should blow your mind.
Yeah.
Out there, available today to anyone, just shift how you're hiring people and, you're going to get a 3x, better outcome and process. I mean, that's huge.
What had you leave Degreed in 2018? Obviously, and go into politics and into the political arena.
So the short version of a rabbit hole I'm not sure you want to go down is I ran for the vice presidency of the United States of America. Um, uh, operated as a candidate for a short period of time and realized that kind of the conversation and change I was hoping to affect was going to be broader reaching just as a democracy reform initiative. And so for about 2 years, ran Vice.Run, which was a signature gathering effort to affect the ballot in every state to be able to vote separately for president and vice president, which is what the 12th Amendment in the Constitution gives us a constitutional right to do. But partisan influence over the ballots has kind of polluted and corrupted over time. And so that is why I stepped down in 2018, was to run for the vice presidency of the United States.
How did that go? And how is the initiative going in the various states? I mean, what was that like? Because you never hear anybody say, "I'm
Yeah.
running for vice president of the United States" without first being picked by somebody, right? Which is what you just described. Like it's been captured by these political parties as to why we all think that way.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of maybe trace through how my brain works the same way that tell me about your education and people will tell you where they go to college is an absurdity. The fact that you just said like the presidential nominees pick, like no one is conditioned to hear it anymore, but like that is a corruption of our government. It is a corruption. We have a constitutional right. The 12th Amendment gives us the right to directly elect our president and our vice president. And we would think it crazy if, it was like, okay, we elect our senators and then we just let them pick which Congress people they want. And we jam it all together on the ballot. And yeah, you still get to vote for what senator you want, but we're essentially giving them the senator the right to just line item in the Congress people they want. And that's what we've done. Truly, the office of president and vice president and are as separate and distinct as governor and senator or president and city council member of your local city. The offices are separate and distinct, and we have a constitutional right to elect them both. Now, why does this matter? Because, I mean, we're also conditioned to just not care about our vice presidents.
Yeah.
But every check and balance, every single check and balance on divided government that was given to us by the founding fathers is vested in the vice presidency. And we are in a time of extremely divided government. And those checks and balances were maybe unimportant in more cooperative eras, but are critical to the survival of our democracy. And even January 6th and Mike Pence, decision not to, endorse Trump's sort of plea to overturn the electors, shows exact. I mean, Mike Pence was the protector of democracy in that moment. And the amount of power that the president exerts over the vice president when we run it this way is immense. Our vice presidents are supposed to be accountable to we the people, democratically elected, but we've just given it up. We've just given that right away. It truly is our constitutional right. And no one knows this. It's a part of our history that's just been lost. And so it was very fascinating. It was just really an interesting thread to pull at, and across America. And we got the signatures required in 7 states before I ran out of money and sort of had to turn it in. But about 75% of people supported it, from red, blue, and independent. People don't like, once you realize that you have a right and then someone took it from you, it really doesn't tend to matter your politics left or right. Once people know, like, oh, I had power and it was taken away from me, like, yeah, I'd want that back. I'd want it back just so I can use it, in the way I want to use it. Even if they're partisan, it's like, yeah, give it back to me so I can use it, to the ends that I think the country needs. But, most people, once they learn, oh, have you ever paid attention or read the, 12th Amendment? Oh, no. Maybe when I was in 8th grade and my, history class assigned it to me or something, but like, yeah, we found broad-based support for it, and hope that it's kind of a thread that might be useful in the conversation as things kind of continue to evolve.
At what point did this change? Because if my memory serves, Thomas Jefferson was John Adams' vice president, and John Adams didn't pick Thomas
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson. In fact, they were different parties. And then when Jefferson got elected, he had Aaron Burr. Was it always like this runner up? Is that how it used to be? Or how? At what point did all of this change? This is actually really fascinating. I have not really thought about this.
Yeah, this is exactly the journey I was on with people for 2 years, and you've got about a 35% better recollection than most, being able to kind of get from George Washington to Aaron Burr. So yeah, I mean, it's George Washington, John Adams, then John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, then Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And how it initially worked was everyone ran for president, one office. And whoever had the most votes was president, and whoever had the second most votes was vice president. And the challenge is that, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, they both ran for president and they tied.
Yeah.
And to break that tie, it goes to the House, and the House voted, and it tied again in the House, and they voted again, and it tied, and it tied, and it tied. And so it went to like 30, well, it was like 34 votes or something. And this is featured in Hamilton the play, which is why, now some people have this kind of refresher of this part of history, which is Alexander Hamilton actually backed Thomas Jefferson, who was of the opposing political party, Federalist and Democratic Republican. And Thomas Jefferson won, but he now has this very acrimonious vice president in Aaron Burr. And Thomas Jefferson's like, shit, that was an acrimonious, like, we can't put the nation through that again. We need to separate these offices. And that's when we got the 12th Amendment, which separated the offices. And so from there, people ran for president and vice president separately. You would seek, the office of president and win or lose, or you would seek the office of vice president and win or lose. And people ran, and then this is the part of history that people just don't know. People ran for vice president separately and distinctly, and we voted separately and distinctly for president and vice president for about 60, 70 years before the party ticket started to influence the ballot And so for about 100 years, or about, maybe depends on what state we're talking about, because every ballot is owned by the state, it was the party who was picking the vice presidents. And that actually is when we had the very worst vice presidents, because it was usually graft. It was usually like whoever had the most political sort of favors or was willing to pay, the most amount of money into the party would just get sort of picked by the party. And then it wasn't until JFK that the nominees started picking their running mates. But everyone has to appreciate that neither of those approaches are what our Constitution says. And you can't just ignore the Constitution. And so what people also don't appreciate is that the Electoral College still votes separately for president and vice president, because you can't just ignore the Constitution. So the system's already built this way. The system already works this way. The one thing you have to change to restore it is our ballot. It's the ballot. The ballot is the only thing that's kind of been corrupted, is when you go to vote, you don't get to vote for vice president anymore. That democratic right has been stolen from you, essentially by the party and by the nominee, who has taken that power and said, I know best. I will choose, the vice president.
It's interesting that it was JFK who was the first to just pick, and 2 years later he gets assassinated, and that guy, ascends to the presidency, which is its own
LBJ.
kind of crazy history. But yeah, then we lionize LBJ, but I'm not sure that we should. What does a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, so after doing the politics, I started a venture studio, launched 2 more operating businesses. Both ended up taking venture capital. And so one is called learnin.com. The other is bookclub.com. Degreed in 2022, acquired Learnin and brought me back as CEO of Degreed. And so I was CEO of Book Club and Degreed in parallel for a moment, transitioned out of being CEO of bookclub.com to a great guy, Jonathan Monk, who's now leading and running that business. And I am back full time as CEO of Degreed. And it's now a global business serving, we're serving about 30% of the Fortune 100 globally, top to bottom, enterprise wide. And, a typical day is right now 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. So, we're in that kind of post-COVID hybrid kind of situation. I travel a lot, travel globally. A lot of it is spent with clients. And then the work I really love is really the product, and so as much time as I can, is on podcasts and working on the product.
How do you find time to write a book? Because in all of this, you've written The Expertise Economy, which is a great book. I highly recommend people do it. We'll put links and stuff into the show notes. What drove you to write the book, and what was that process like? How long did it take you, given everything else you're working on?
Yeah. So I co-wrote that with who was previously the chief learning officer of LinkedIn, a woman named Kelly Palmer. She's now the head of strategy at a university, a very innovative university called SNHU, Southern New Hampshire University. And, it's really about kind of wrestling this story back. I mean, I think that's been kind of one of the themes of my career is taking, people think this way, it's no longer serving us especially well. How do you wrestle the narrative back? And, spilling the ink in a book was one way of doing that, as a way of just advocating for this more skills-based future, one where people should be able to walk any pathway and get credit for it. It shouldn't matter where you went to university if you have the skills and can demonstrate the knowledge. And so it was one more way of telling that story.
We only have a couple more minutes here, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I have 2 more questions for you. One is, you mentioned you work from home 2 days a week, in the office 3 days a week, which to me means you've chosen the hybrid approach in the debate between work from home, all virtual, or all in the office. What about that? How did you come to that decision?
Yeah, Degreed was co-located in hybrid from the beginning and kind of before it was cool. I remember pitching VCs in the early days, and when they hear that we had our engineering office in Salt Lake City, it was not met favorably. They were like, you're in Silicon Valley. These are the best engineers in the world. Like, what are you doing hiring people in Salt Lake City, Utah? And then by about like 2015, 2016, when I was raising like the Series B and the Series C, and people would hear that I had engineering in Utah, they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, brilliant, great move." So like the tides shifted over time. Certainly, the culture of remote versus in office has shifted. COVID has certainly informed it. So have always kind of had this muscle. Have always appreciated a bit of the flexibility. But it's a weird and strange thing to leave a company and come back. And it's one thing to kind of build a culture from the ground up. It's kind of, like biologically having a kid, you get them on day zero and you get to learn kind of a little bit at a time versus, maybe adopting or marrying into, teenage stepchildren. Like coming back, it's now like it's like those stepchildren. It's a teenager. It has a mind of its own, and affecting kind of the ways in which you want to operate. I've just found actually, takes more effort and intentionality, and so kind of gathering people is one of the ways I think it's important to kind of share that, imbue that in an organization, but still value some autonomy and flexibility and empowering people and what's going to serve them in their lives as well. So we're kind of balancing. We're one of the ones that's just kind of in the middle, balancing it all.
I said only two more, but I actually have one more after this. What are you reading? What reading recommendations would you have for us?
So love, love, love books. Right now, I'm reading Working Backwards, which is a very operational, sort of focused book on how Amazon operationally works. I am also reading The Obstacle is the Way, which is sort of a modern take on Stoicism.
Ryan Holiday, right?
And Ryan Holiday,
Yeah.
yep, just finished the Walter Isaacson, Elon Musk book. And if I were to recommend maybe just one of my favorite reads, um, there's a book called Blitzed, which is a take on Blitzkrieg from World War II. And it's the story of how drugs in the Third Reich, both Hitler himself as well as um, the whole German army was on drugs for all of World War II. And we don't talk about it in our history books, but the drug use meaningfully affected, like Blitzkrieg. I was just assumed, they were just hardcore marching and going fast. No, they were all on meth and cocaine and didn't sleep for like 9 days. And like Blitzkrieg literally came from the fact that they were just all drugged up. And so it's this overlay of how drug use sort of was determinant in the outcomes of World War II. And it's just a crazy lens, that you've never thought of, but altered history forever. And it's a fast read. It's a fascinating read. It's just a crazy book. Highly recommend that one. So Blitzed.
Finally, we ask everybody the same question at the end of the interview, and that is CEO.com. We believe the chances one gives is just as important as the chances one takes. When you hear that, who gave you a chance to get you to where you are today?
I have many, but will honor the name of Chris Iyer, who I met on an airplane as you hear stories sitting next to someone. It wasn't even that. We were getting off the airplane. He saw a Canadian flag I had on my backpack, which was from the LDS mission that I served in Canada. And as we are walking off the jet bridge, he sees it and he says, "Oh, are you Canadian?" I said, "No, but I lived there for 2 years." He said, "Oh, were you a missionary?" I said, "I was." He said, "Which mission?" I said, "Toronto." He said, "Oh, I was the mission president there." So we had this common connection. We're walking off a jet bridge. He says, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm an entrepreneur." "What do you do?" He said, "I'm a VC." And he ended up being the first person to support me and write a check into Degreed after I had pitched literally dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of VCs. Everyone had told me no. He believed in me, gave me a chance when no one else would. And without him, absolutely, there would be no Degreed today. So, very grateful to Chris Iyer.
It's incredible. David, thank you so much for taking so much time with us. Really appreciate it, man. Best of luck with everything.
Thanks, Clint. It's good to be on, man.